Hello everyone, my name is Olivia, and today I want to talk about some of my favorite books, which are sad books, or books that made me cry. I'm not one to cry when reading a book. It's very rare for me that I end up actually crying because I feel like I cry more when I watch films because it's a very visual experience. You connect more with the characters because you see their anguish and their pain. And I feel like when I'm reading a book, I don't feel that type of pain as often, but some of my favorite books are really sad novels. So, inspired by Noelle, who talked about her favorite books that made her cry, I am here to tell you about a couple of books that did end up making me very emotional, and I'm very excited to get into this because one of my favorite things are sad novels. So, hopefully, if you're also in that boat, you can get some recommendations from me because I don't know. I just really like when a book can evoke a lot of emotions from me, which is very rare for me, but these are books that did evoke so many emotions from me. So the first book that made me emotional actually did not make me cry, but let it be known if I did have my period while reading this book, I probably would have been more of a mess. That book is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This is one of my favorite books of 2020. It really took my reading world by storm and completely engrossed me. It is such a heartbreaking novel discussing grief and loss, and it is actually like a retelling of Shakespeare's life because it does follow Shakespeare's family, primarily his wife Anne Hathaway, and her entire experience of being married to William Shakespeare and raising 3 children, and the grief and loss that comes along with that when they're living during a plague. This book is so beautifully written and relies a lot on descriptions rather than dialogue, and I think that internal monologue that we see with Anne Hathaway and just getting to feel her emotions and really walk in her footsteps was such a unique experience because she is a woman in history that we don't hear a lot about besides her being married to William Shakespeare. So we get a very in-depth look into her life and how she reacted to these moments in her life that were so saddening, and it was just such a beautiful read that also made me very emotional, and I just could not stop reading it because I wanted to know what was going to happen next. Even though you know it's going to be a very sad moment, you're still somewhat looking forward to it because you want to finally hit that point. So this book did not make me cry, but I feel like if I was in a more emotional state, I probably would have cried a lot while reading this, and I'm sure a lot of people can connect to this as well because if you love William Shakespeare, you're going to love this novel. A book that made me cry and cry and cry to no end was Salt to the Sea by Rita Sepetys. This book I feel like is a very underrated YA novel. Even though Rita Sepetys is a pretty popular author, I just feel like nobody talks about her books enough, and I just love her historical fiction novels because they always highlight a piece of history that's not as well known as other points in history. So this follows a group of characters in World War II. They are all from different countries, but they are coming together in this one moment to try and flee the Soviet Union. And I'm just going to read you a sentence from the synopsis of the book because I haven't read this one in a while. And it says, inspired by the single greatest tragedy in maritime history, best-selling and award-winning author Rita Sepetys lifts the veil on a shockingly little-known casualty of World War II. It is just absolutely mind-boggling that nobody really talks about this piece of history when so many lives were lost. What I really enjoy about this novel is that it follows 4 different people from 4 very different walks of life. And one of my favorite things is the exploration of the human connection, because even though we live such very different lives, once you connect with a person under a very dire circumstance, that connection is so strong and so beautiful. And I think that's what makes this book so strong because you get to really understand these 4 different characters even though you're always flip-flopping between their perspectives. Slowly but surely you unravel their history and their pain and you connect to them and you just want them to be safe even though you know that tragedy is going to strike. And I think if you are a fan of historical fiction, and I think if you're a fan of learning about pieces of history that aren't spoken about a lot, I would highly recommend this one because I feel like this is a part of our history that we should not brush under the rug. Another book that made me absolutely sob while just laying in bed was The End of Loneliness by Benedict Wells. This is actually translated from German because I'm trying to read more translated fiction, so if you also have translated fiction recommendations but are also sad, put them in the comments down below because I would love to hear your recommendations. I listened to this on audiobook, and this is actually the only book on this list that I listened to on audiobook and sobbed my eyes out. I originally started this physically, but I wanted to read it on audiobook because I just felt like listening to someone else read the story was a much more engaging experience for me just for this type of writing style. So I would listen to this novel every night before bed, and it got to a certain point in the story that I was just crying my eyes out because this deals a lot with grief. It follows three siblings who lose their parents at a very young age, and then it follows them as they kind of split apart and make their own lives for themselves while also reconnecting over time. And we follow this one main character who falls in love with a girl at his school who's kind of dealing with the same issues that he is dealing with, and over time they separate but they reconnect as adults, and through that connection they grow closer to one another, but they're also dealing heavily with grief, and that grief is so subtle but it's so loud in this novel because it's there at every single moment. It's always hanging over these characters. And as someone who is dealing with grief, and I feel like I'll never actually let go of that feeling because I'm always dealing with it in different ways and it just kind of comes to you in waves, I just connected with this novel on a whole different level. I think it came into my life at the right moment because it validated my feelings as someone who was grieving while also showing me a different side of grieving because this person lost someone in a very different way. It was a very different relationship than the relationship that I lost. And I just think that when you are grieving, some people may want to avoid reading about grief, but others may kind of cling to it. And for me, I definitely do seek out books about grief because I just want to feel validated in my feelings. So this one hit really close to home, and it was just kind of like a shock. I didn't really see it coming. I didn't feel that sadness coming, but when it finally hit, I could not stop crying. I just kept on sobbing and sobbing my eyes out. And while the writing style was a little bit hard to get into in the beginning, I just think that it was absolutely superb. And if an audiobook can make me sob my eyes out, it's a pretty freaking good audiobook. Another book that absolutely made me sob right when I finished the novel, right when I closed it, I just kind of put the novel down and bursted into tears, and it is The Book of Lost Saints by Daniel Jose Older. This is a novel that follows two Cuban characters that are related to one another. So we follow Ramon, who lives in present-day New Jersey, and he keeps on getting visited by the spirit of his lost aunt Marisol. Marisol disappeared in Cuba during the revolution, and nobody has ever heard of her again, and he keeps on getting messages and glimpses into her past through her spirit, and he kind of lives through her history through the glimpses that she shows him. So as Ramon keeps on getting these visions from his aunt, who he had actually never met, he starts to dig deeper into her history to hopefully find out answers as to why she disappeared and where she possibly could have gone. This book is such a subtle book in the way that it touches upon generational trauma, especially from exiles, and just the way that the history of a family can go down through a bloodline into present day. And it talks about the Cuban Revolution while also talking about being Cuban in America and how those two lives are very different from one another, but how they both greatly affect one another. I feel like particularly for Cubans, you are always asking your elders for stories about Cuba if you have not visited it before, like Ramon, and you are always trying to piece your history together to get a glimpse into their lives in a country that you have never seen and don't really know much about unless you've experienced it. So being Cuban, you're always kind of trying to pick up little pieces of your history to create a storyline, and that's what Ramon is doing with the life of his aunt Marisol, who is visiting him as a spirit. And this book was very emotional for me because it didn't hit me right until the actual last page how emotional this story was, because I read this book after losing my grandma, who was my main connection to Cuba, my main connection to our history. And once you lose that piece, you have so many regrets, you have so many questions that are left unanswered that you will never be able to ask them again. And it reminds you that history is very fragile, and you should just always be asking questions to your elders, because once they're gone, and that piece of their life and that piece of your culture is very hard to get back, and that's what impacted me the most. This is a very niche type of emotional novel because I don't know if other people will find it as emotional as I did, but it just made me feel seen in ways that I cannot describe, and I'm just so grateful for it because it touched upon so many different topics that I never actually explored internally, and I'm so grateful for the discussion of generational trauma, of loss, of moving to a different country and leaving everything behind and just kind of exploring your past and trying to piece that all together. It was just so good. My last 3 novels are pretty basic in terms of like sad novels. I feel like everyone always recommends these, but I'm going to recommend them to you anyways. One of the books that made me cry the most out of any other book that I've ever read in my life is A Little Life. A Little Life is just sadness from page 1 to page whatever it is that it ends. A Little Life is not for the faint of heart. It's a very harrowing, it's a very heartbreaking novel that will just has so many different aspects that are incredibly sad and incredibly upsetting, and I know that not a lot of people will enjoy this because it just feels like it's always trying to tug at your heartstrings. I've never felt so emotionally connected to a group of characters. Because this is such a gigantic novel, you really get a deep insight into their life and how they grow up and grow older, because we follow these characters from when they're in college to when they're like 50 years old. So you get to journey alongside them for a very long time. A Little Life is just a very dark novel. I cannot stress to you enough how dark this novel is. I feel like I would definitely search up the content warnings before reading this novel because I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I feel like it can really catch you off guard, so I would definitely be careful about that because I just cannot stress how dark this novel is. But I'm also grateful for the amount of emotion that it evoked from me and just how impactful it was in its writing. It's unlike anything I've ever experienced before in terms of reading a novel, and I'm just really in awe of how it's constructed and how it can just rip you apart emotionally. Another novel that's pretty basic that did make me cry is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. The Song of Achilles is a novel that I picked up on a whim because I love mythological retellings, so I was like, you know what? I saw this so much on Tumblr, I saw so many quotes from it, I saw so many aesthetics from it back in the Tumblr days. So I picked it up, and I'll just let you know now, I did not know the story of Achilles, so I didn't know how his story ended. And if you also don't know but you want to read this novel, don't Google it beforehand, just kind of go into this novel without knowing much. But The Song of Achilles is just a journey. It's a journey somewhat similar to A Little Life in the way that you follow this character for a long amount of time. You get to really see them grow up from a boy to a man, and the mistakes made along the way, the relationships crafted along the way, and the loss that Achilles has to go through. And his relationship with Patroclus is just so beautiful and wonderful, and I just love them so much. And Madeline Miller is just such a gifted writer in the way that she writes relationships, in the way that she just crafts a story. And the Song of Achilles just made me bawl my eyes out, and it was just such a wonderful story, and it's actually one of my favorite stories of all time. Speaking of favorite books of all time, my last book that made me cry is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is like a fan favorite of BookTube and Bookstagram and book lovers everywhere, and I feel like it's so highly deserved. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and it's actually one of my first novels where I saw a Cuban main character, and while this isn't Own Voices in the way that Taylor Jenkins Reid is not Cuban, from what I know, it still was so impactful to see a character that was so similar to me in personality. And I am just so grateful for this novel because it felt like a mirror was being held up to me. And that's something that I've never experienced before, while also mixing together some of my favorite things, like it being a historical fiction novel and it being centered around old Hollywood. Those are some of my favorite things. I feel like Taylor Jenkins Reid took all of my favorite interests, took my personality, and threw it into this novel. And I feel like once you find a novel like that where you feel so seen, you feel so validated, it just leaves you so emotional. So when I finished this novel, I was not only crying about the story itself, but I was just crying because I've never felt so seen before. And I'm just so grateful for Taylor Jenkins Reid for writing this novel. I just cannot recommend it enough if you have not read it before. So that is it. Those are some of my favorite novels that have made me very emotional to the point where I sobbed in bed or cried a couple of tears. But be sure to let me know some of your favorite emotional novels, but don't spoil the ending. Just keep it very vague and leave some recommendations that you think I would love down below as well. And if I ever find a ton of novels that make me cry in the future, I will be sure to make a part 2 because some of my favorite novels in the world are ones that made me cry because I just love how certain novels can evoke so many emotions from you, and I just think that's such a beautiful thing to find a book that just can make you feel so much. I think that's so cool, and that's probably why some of my favorite movies are also really sad. But I hope you enjoyed these recommendations. I hope you enjoyed me talking about these novels and why they made me emotional. And if you have not followed me on Instagram, be sure to follow me over there. It's the same username as it is here, and be sure to subscribe if you have not done so already. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in another video. Bye!